together to drive that. And I think the third role is participation in the process, partly as an investor, but also partly as a provider of key services, in particular for critical metals, where the downstream side of that is still fairly complex and actually needs quite a bit of support to build that. So turning to organizations, I think, we spoke about agility and we spoke about resilience. I think organizations should lay the foundations for that. Some of it sits in managing risk in a very integrated way and anticipating vulnerabilities before they actually happen so that we are prepared for those. Even in the case of companies, I think there's a big ask of collaboration. And again, if I can use the African proverb, if I want to go fast, I'll go alone. If I want to go far, I'll go together. I think the thinking around companies working together to solve energy problems, to solve sustainability problems is the way to go. And then I think as an industry, we will need to start thinking about how do we generate a lower intensity of use in terms of driving efficiencies in our operations, running our assets better. If you want to make a successful energy transition, you actually have to run your assets better first before you make the final transition to more sustainable energy.
Right. Thank you. Dave, ESG is really important. And talking about threats, one of the trends is also digitization, which by definition means perhaps more efficiencies and perhaps a little bit less jobs, at least in certain situations, in a continent that really needs a lot of job creation for the youth. How does one approach sort of that dynamic and to some extent, how should one approach community development in a context like that?
Yeah, Boubacar, that's an extremely difficult question, and I think as an industry we're still trying to grapple with the right solution to that, and I think over time we will continue to evolve. The challenge that we have is balancing the expectations of local communities and employment versus, to Johan's very good point, is if we want to transition, or when we want to transition to sustainable mining and reducing our carbon footprint, we are going to have to get a lot more efficient. It's going to require new technologies, it's going to require automation. There's lots of change that's going to come that, as you say, will have a direct impact, possibly on the previous way of thinking. So operators and maintainers that were working on operating a truck and had a mechanic that's working on that truck. As an industry, we're starting to see a shift. So if you previously would have had a truck operator, now you may find that job creation will move to a different role, supporting the infrastructure, supporting the setups associated with that automation on the site. The challenge to that is that's only a technology or an environment that will last for the length of the life of the mine. And so we need to be thinking about what are industries or areas that we can improve or accelerate for job opportunities that are alternative to the mine and maybe supports the mine during the operation time, but when the mine shuts down, we'll continue to operate. And to my colleague's earlier comment around micro power systems, I think that's a key understanding. If you look at the transition towards solar panel, battery operated sites that are standalone, can generate their own power, there is a fantastic opportunity to grow the size of those, have those operated by communities, and at the point that the mine site leaves, that power then gets injected back into the grid, whether it's localised in a micro grid or whether it can be moved from there. But I think that there are two examples of possible changes that we can shift, and I think as an industry we need to work together, we need to think about what our options are and how we support each other. There is a competitive advantage in some of these areas, but if we work together as a whole, we'll end up in a much better position faster than if we try to compete. And I think that also leads into the partnership with governments and communities on what are opportunities that we can do to try and improve that area.
Right. Thank you. Natasha, talking about infrastructure, this time transport infrastructure, another sort of really important dimension. Transport is quite a challenge in Africa. In fact, there are 30 plus deposits of iron ore, bauxite, manganese, and whatnot in Africa, which in many other continents would have been in production because of a lack of or the insufficiency of infrastructure. What needs to be rethinked in terms of approaches to infrastructure development? What new ways could be developed to speed up infrastructure development and for multiple uses and for multiple users?
I think two concepts come to mind if I listen to your question. The one is collaboration and the other one is execution. Within the space of collaboration, it's important for us to consider who's best suited to do what work. So if we consider, and I think there's probably a couple of big players in execution here. You obviously have government, and you have government setting the right policies, creating a stable investment environment, and we've seen the South African government already doing quite a number of that. Just from a mining point of view, our mining charter is leading the way. We've seen a level of stability over the last number of years. So that is the work of government, right? Then we need to consider, well, who's the best place to execute on development work, and with the emphasis on execute. How do we get the private sector to really step in and execute on the aspects that we need for economic development? And again, a couple of examples come to mind, because I do think we need to start to shift from having conversations around this and being courageous in stepping into execution in the end of the day. We've recently launched one of the biggest public-private partnerships on water infrastructure into the Far Eastern Limb, 25 billion partnership between mining houses and government. And that execution is led by a collective it's a true public-private partnership. And I think the same goes whether we're talking energy, whether we're talking energy clusters, microgrids, transport. How do we bring the people together who are basically positioned to do the best work? I think the other important player that we often underestimate is our smaller players. We are talking about mining, we're talking about bigger mining houses, but the reality is I'm really encouraged and fascinated if you just listen to what's been happening over the last couple of days and how smaller players are doing their little bit around how SMMEs are coming to the fore using IP, South African IP. One such a company, Bombele, comes to mind, who's working with UCT IP that we have in South Africa to produce fuel cell membranes, as an example. We underestimate the capability and the capacity in our countries for entrepreneurs and smaller businesses to come to the party to help to execute. And the same goes for our transport sector. And if you consider just how many trucks we have on the road, because immediately as we start to enter into a challenge on rail, what happens? The private sector, the smaller players step in and they start to put trucks on the road. So how do we continue to really leverage that kind of capacity that we have across all of the players? And that obviously plays directly, you've had the question around local economic development, how we bring our communities along. It creates so many opportunities for us to do that. Now, our president said this morning we should stop criticizing and start participating. And I think we underestimate the level of urgency that there is for participation across the industry, whether it's energy, whether it's transport. I think in all of those, leveraging those. But we need to be specific. What is government's role in there? And I would argue if you consider rail, if you consider energy, be very clear. Is transmission there? Because on a microgrid, you can leverage so much more if we've got the transmission in place. And it's those kind of things that I think we need to be very clear on. And there's enough examples where people stepped into the fray and actually starting to make it happen. So the question is, how do we harness more of that capability and energy?
For talking about microgrids and building on what Natasha was saying, looking at some examples in Africa of companies working on decarbonization and building solar plants, how do we make sure that this power is also not only benefiting communities living around, but how do we make sure that it is done in such a way that communities are left with something at the end of mines, and who should potentially bear the cost of the extra that needs to be done for that to happen?
Well, firstly, I think we need to ensure that we make integration, or perhaps even integrated planning, a top priority for all governments on the continent. Integrated planning bottom up and top down. But whatever the burning platform is in a power block or in an economic block, what we found is that the burning platform of load shedding, as the President was saying earlier this morning, President Ramaphosa, in South Africa, we have found that in the last 100 or so days that we've been active as a new board, we've benefited greatly together with the ESCOM management from the work done by the President through the National Energy Crisis Committee, where a concept has been put in place that seeks to drive agility in decision making. We as ESCOM put together a turnaround plan that seeks to ensure that we restore energy availability. That turnaround plan then was presented to this, we call it NECOM, this integration committee that is chaired by the President, where we articulated the externalities to ESCOM that are necessary to remove obstacles. Whether it's to your point, to create a feed-in tariff so that whoever puts in additional power can then deliver their surplus onto the grid, whether it's land servitudes, all these key dependencies. We found that there's an idea of doing action labs. So you put every decision maker in the room and literally go from one decision maker to say, what are you going to do from a revenue point of view, from a regulatory point of view, from a land point of view, all these decision makers in the same room, and when they leave the room, a package of decisions are then presented to the President to approve where his approval is needed. So I would think that if we were to take that model and look at, for instance, we have in South Africa, last time I checked, Natasha leads an energy council that is trying to put industry together. So for instance, if you took that energy council model and you took the power pools that already exist, thirdly, you take the associations of minerals council, given that